Okay, we have a great book, Slave Rebellion in Brazil, the Muslim Uprising of 1835 in Bahia. This is by Joha Jose Reis. This is an international political, ethnic, economic, legislative, cultural, and transnational history examined on events on January 24th, 1835 in Salvador, Brazil. This work is organized for the incorporation of extensive court records and subsequent draconian slave legislation associated with this uprising. This is one of the largest and most successful slave uprisings that occurred in Brazil or in the Caribbean. I believe in all of South America. In 1835, African-born slaves and freedmen used the city element to the freedom that they had in the city element to communicate, coordinate, and execute a rebellion that was one of the biggest of its time. There was a large focus on the fact that these people were primarily Muslim and that they spoke an Arabic language. And I believe that that focus as to where this was some type of jihad or something like that was merely to downplay how intelligent and how basically the oppressive white culture had gotten outsmarted. I don't think that this was a religious thing. It was obviously self-defense. Now, it was not, it did start primarily with African-born people who were in Brazil and grew up in Brazil and were born in Brazil. They weren't included initially, though there had been records uncovered that ultimately they understood that all of the blacks would have to unite. But to start it off, they dealt with people that had like backgrounds. So some of the people, just like now, were more ingrained into their condition. So, which was the downfall of Nat Turner's rebellion, where it was a slave to told. Well, they dealt with people who were still new enough to that experience that the rebellion was strong in them. So the core group was from the Africans that were transported over. Ultimately, at the point of the result, the African participants and freedmen numbered in the hundreds, and after several clashes with militia, over 500 revolutionaries were subsequently executed as punishment for their participation. A unique distinction illustrated in Reis's research is the fact that the Brazilian-born slaves were excluded from the planning. Communication and inclusion was limited to those who shared religious and ethnic networks that would make the revolt successful, African and freedmen. Now, Reis did point out that there were plans to eventually unite all slaves, including those in the countryside. Now, the countryside was harder to get to, obviously, because they had a greater degree of restriction on their movement. But in the city, the proximity was so much closer. So if I could just go from one house to another, I could see somebody that I could communicate with, especially if we spoke another language. That made it a lot more to our advantage. If I had to criticize this, I would say that I believe that the centrality of the Muslim religion was almost unnecessary. If it would be included, I would use that inclusion of it to show how little it had to do with the success of it and how it's used in history as being more of an asset that it was. It was people thinking that made the success that it was. It was not the religion. It appeared that the empowered culture, Brazilian whites and mulattoes, were looking for a reason that it was outsmarted by the revolution and decided that the idea had to come from religion rather than the independent collective slave intellect and strategy. If the solidarity taught by the Muslim religion empowered these slaves, why weren't Muslim revolts more prevalent and happening constantly in Muslim, heavily populated Muslim areas? But even with that, I think this was a great book. It again talked, I believe, in too many cases the bottom up communication is not there. We hear that slavery went on for hundreds of years, but we don't hear about why it went on for hundreds of years. It didn't go on for hundreds of years because people didn't mind it. It went on under great protest, under great dissent, and under great fight. These people were not accepting of this system, and that was why many people had said throughout history that it would implode because it was too volatile. What do we have here? The leaders were African slave freedmen. There's a lot in this story that it's hard to delineate what the whites put in it, because of course when it comes out of the legislation, a lot of the research material is going to come out of the interviews and court records that happen afterward, the executions and all of that. And there is a lot of information that I do not doubt the research of Mr. Reis at all. At the same time, some things just hit the ear funny as to where there is some representation that there was a split between the Brazilian-born Africans and the Brazilian-born slaves and the African-born slaves. And then at the same time, there was talk of a communication between, knowing that there needs to be a unification of effort. That is where I like as much oral history as possible. I believe oral history is just as substantiated as written history. I believe oral history by poor people is as valid as written history by empowered people. I believe both are embellished, but if we function with an understanding that the truth is always going to be somewhere in the middle, we have to have some representation of the unempowered in the process of getting a full understanding of the circumstance. Even if the circumstance is being embellished, Why is it being embellished, and why is it being embellished that way? So again, Religion and Slave Rebellion in Bahia. This is by Jose Reis. It's the slave rebellion in Brazil, the Muslim uprising of 1835 in Bahia, Bhia.